In the early 1990s, Hollywood was a very different place. But one thing remained the same. The people in charge loved to put actors in boxes. If you were funny, you were only funny. If you were a serious actor, you couldn't tell a joke. And if you were Keanu Reeves, you were just a goofy guy who said whoa a lot. This is the story of how a group of powerful executives almost made a terrible mistake by betting against a man who refused to give up. It is a story about doubting the underdog. It's the price you pay when you underestimate someone's heart. Back then, Keanu was famous, but not necessarily respected. He had become a teen icon because of the Bill and Ted movies. To the general public, he was just a happy, maybe not-so-bright surfer dude on screen. But inside, Keanu was burning with a desire to be more. He wanted to be an action star. He wanted to be the hero who saved the day. The problem was, nobody in power believed he could do it. They only saw the long hair and the casual attitude. They didn't see the fighter underneath. When the script for a movie called Speed started floating around town, it was the hottest thing in Hollywood. It was a high-octane thriller about a bus that would explode if it dropped below 50 miles per hour. It was intense, dangerous, and required a leading man who was tough, commanding, and fearless. The studio bosses at 20th Century Fox had a very specific idea of who that should be. They wanted guys like Tom Cruise, Brad Pitt, or Bruce Willis. They wanted the established tough guys. When Keanu Reeves' name came up, the executives in their fancy suits actually laughed. They thought the idea of Ted from Bill and Ted saving a bus full of people was ridiculous. They thought it would be a comedy, not a thriller. However, the director of the movie, a man named Jan de Bont, saw something different. He had worked with Keanu before and knew there was a fire in him. He fought for Keanu. Eventually, the studio gave in, but not because they believed in him. They gave in because the other big stars turned the movie down, and Keanu was willing to work for a lower price. They thought they were getting a bargain, but deep down, they viewed him as a placeholder. They were already preparing their excuses. In their minds, if the movie failed, they could just blame the actor who didn't know what he was doing. As production began, the mood on the set was tense. The studio executives were watching everything like hawks. They were nervous. Every day, reports went back to the studio office about how the filming was going. They didn't like the rough cuts they were seeing. They thought Keanu was too soft. They thought his voice was too light. They panicked. It wasn't long before whispers started to circulate through Hollywood. The studio was seriously considering firing Keanu. They thought about reshooting scenes with a different actor or heavily editing the film to reduce his role. They genuinely believed that kicking him out was the smart business move to save their investment. They thought they were fixing a mistake. Imagine being in Keanu's shoes during that time. You are giving everything you have, sweating and bleeding for a role. And you know that the people paying you are just waiting for an excuse to fire you. A weaker person would have crumbled. A weaker person would have gotten angry or walked away. But Keanu did something unexpected. He didn't argue with them. He didn't fight them with words. Instead, he decided to let his actions speak for him. He realized that the only way to shut the doubters up was to be so good, so dedicated, that they couldn't ignore him. Keanu showed up to work every day with a determination that scared everyone. He wasn't playing a character anymore. He was becoming a hero. The physical demands of Speed were insane. It wasn't just acting. It was an athletic event. There were scenes on top of a moving bus, jumping onto cars, and fighting in a cramped, speeding subway car. Many actors would have used a stunt double for every dangerous moment, sitting comfortably in a chair while someone else took the risk. Not Keanu. He wanted to do it all. He spent months training before the cameras even rolled. He learned how to handle weapons, how to move like a cop, and how to take a hit. During filming, when the stunt coordinators told him something was too dangerous, he would look at them and say, "Let's try it." He suffered injuries, bruises, and cuts, but he never complained. He was the first one on set and the last one to leave. He treated the crew with respect, buying dinner for everyone and carrying equipment like a normal guy. The crew, who initially just saw him as a movie star, began to love him. They saw his heart. They saw that he wasn't pretending to be tough. He was actually doing the work. The turning point came during the filming of the subway scene. This was the climax of the movie, the most dangerous part. The studio executives came down to the set to watch, likely looking for reasons to pull the plug. They stood on the sidelines, with their arms crossed, expecting disaster. But what they saw left them speechless. They saw Keanu running on top of a moving subway train, risking his life for a shot. They saw him engaging in a brutal fistfight that looked terrifyingly real. The energy on the set was electric. The director, Jan, was capturing lightning in a bottle. Keanu was the lightning. The executives looked at the monitors, and for the first time, they stopped seeing Ted. They saw a movie star. They saw a man who was carrying an entire movie on his shoulders. The director refused to listen to any notes about firing Keanu or changing the actor. He told them that Keanu was the movie. Seeing the raw footage, the studio finally realized they had been wrong. The plan to kick him out was quietly abandoned. They stopped fighting him and started hoping he would succeed. When Speed was finally released in the summer of 1994, the reaction was explosive. The movie was a massive hit from day one. Critics were shocked. They praised the film for its pace and its tension. But they especially praised Keanu. They said he was charismatic, athletic, and commanding. The audience fell in love with him. He wasn't the goofy surfer anymore. He was Jack Traven, the action hero. The movie made hundreds of millions of dollars, turning into a global phenomenon. The studio executives who had wanted to fire him must have been feeling pretty silly. The actor they thought was a liability had become their biggest asset. They had tried to play it safe, thinking they knew better than anyone else, but they had been proven completely wrong. Keanu didn't just survive the experience, he conquered it. He used that success to launch one of the most unique careers in Hollywood history. He went on to make The Matrix and the John Wick series, cementing his place as one of the greatest action stars of all time. Looking back, the story isn't just about a movie. It's a lesson about human nature. It is easy to look at someone and think you know what they are capable of. It is easy to judge a book by its cover or an actor by their previous roles. The executives let their pride and their fear blind them. They thought holding power made them right, but they forgot that true power comes from hard work and resilience. Keanu Reeves proved that you don't have to be loud or arrogant to be strong. He proved that the best response to doubt is not anger, but excellence. When they thought kicking him out was a good idea, he simply worked harder until he made it impossible for them to let him go. In the end, he didn't just save the bus in the movie. He saved his own career by refusing to let other people define his limits. And that is a reality more exciting than any fiction. As the camera started rolling on the set of Speed, the atmosphere in Hollywood was strange. On one side, you had the film crew and the director, working tirelessly in the heat and dust of Los Angeles to make something exciting. On the other side, you had the studio executives sitting in their air-conditioned, high-rise offices feeling a growing sense of panic. This is the part of the story where the pressure really started to build. It wasn't enough that they didn't believe in Keanu Reeves. Now, they were actively looking for ways to undo the mistake they thought they had made by hiring him, to understand why the studio was so nervous. You have to understand what movies looked like back then. In the early 90s, action heroes were usually huge. Muscular men who shouted catchphrases and fired machine guns without flinching. They were invincible. They were bigger than life. Keanu Reeves was not that. He was lean, he was younger, and he had a softness to him. When the executives watched the early footage coming in from the set, what they called dailies, they didn't see a tough guy. They saw someone who looked, in their opinion, a bit scared. They saw someone who looked vulnerable. To them, vulnerability looked like weakness. They were convinced that the audience would laugh at him, not with him. The tension began to grow behind the scenes. The studio heads were powerful people who were used to getting their way. They had invested a lot of money into this movie, and fear of losing that money makes people do irrational things. They started holding secret meetings. In these meetings, they didn't talk about how to support the actor. They talked about damage control. They discussed the possibility of firing Keanu. They even floated the idea of bringing in a different actor to reshoot his scenes. Or perhaps marketing the movie in a way that tricked people into thinking it was about the bus. not the man driving it. Imagine being the director, Jan de Bont, in the middle of this storm. He was a first-time director who had fought hard to get Keanu the role. Every day, he had to deal with phone calls from the studio. They would question every choice he made. Why is he running like that? Why does he look so worried? Can't we make him tougher? Jan had to constantly defend his actor. He knew that Keanu's performance was real. He knew that an action hero who looks scared makes the danger feel real too. But try explaining that to a room full of accountants who only cared about numbers. They refused to listen. They were convinced that their gut instinct was right and that the movie was heading for disaster. Rumors are like poison in Hollywood. It didn't take long for the whispers to reach the set. The crew members, who were working long hours in difficult conditions, started hearing that the star might be replaced. This is a terrible thing for a film set. Morale is everything. If the actors and crew don't trust that the movie is going to be finished, the energy dies. But the crew saw something the studio didn't see. They saw Keanu arrive at 4 o'clock in the morning. They saw him studying his lines until his eyes were red. They saw him helping the lighting crew move heavy equipment. They saw a man who was humble and hardworking. One specific incident highlighted just how deep the disconnect was. There was a scene involving a dangerous jump under a freeway overpass. The stunt coordinators planned it carefully, but the studio executives got wind of it. They were terrified, not for Keanu's safety, but for the insurance costs. They flew out to the location to shut down the stunt. They wanted to use a dummy or do it with computer effects, which at the time looked very fake. When they arrived, they found Keanu already suited up, ready to go. He wasn't asking for a stunt double. He was asking for the countdown. The executives tried to order him down, treating him like a child who didn't know any better. Keanu didn't shout back. He just looked at the director and waited for a decision. The director, seeing the determination in Keanu's eyes, told the executives to step back. They filmed the stunt. It was perfect. But instead of being impressed, the executives left the set angry, feeling like they had lost control of their project. Back in the editing rooms, things were getting even worse. The studio executives started trying to fix the movie in post-production before it was even finished. They wanted to change the music to sound more like a traditional action film. They wanted to edit Keanu's dialogue to make him sound grittier. They were trying to surgically alter the movie to fit their vision, completely ignoring the film that was actually being made. They were so focused on what they thought an action star should be that they couldn't see what was right in front of them. A new kind of action star who was relatable, human, and incredibly brave. The pressure was mounting on Keanu personally. It is one thing to read bad reviews. It is another thing to know your bosses are plotting to fire you. Most actors would have hired a lawyer or gone to the press to tell their side of the story. They would have tried to play politics. But Keanu took a different path. He internalized the pressure and used it as fuel. He felt the weight of their doubt, and he decided to carry it. He thought, "You think I'm weak? Watch this." He began to push his body to the absolute limit. If the studio wanted tough, he would give them toughness, but on his own terms. He trained harder for the fight scenes. He spent his lunches with the SWAT consultants, learning how to hold a gun and how to move tactically. He stopped smiling on set. He became the character, Jack Traven, with a quiet, simmering intensity. The crew noticed the change immediately. He wasn't being a diva. He was becoming a warrior. He was preparing for a war that he knew was happening, even if nobody was talking about it out loud. The climax of this conflict happened during a private screening of the first, rough cut of the movie. The studio executives gathered in a dark theater, expecting to see a mess that they could use as an excuse to take over the movie. They brought their notepads, ready to write down every flaw. As the movie played, the room was silent. But it wasn't the silence of disappointment. It was the silence of shock. The footage on the screen was gripping. The pace was relentless. And Keanu Reeves was magnetic. Without the shiny gloss of a finished film, the raw energy of the performance was undeniable. The scene where the bus first has to jump the gap in the freeway was heart-stopping. You could see the fear on Keanu's face, but you could also see the resolve. The executives walked out of that screening in a daze. They didn't fire him that day. They didn't call the director to yell at him. They realized, perhaps for the first time, that they might have been wrong. But the damage had been done. The trust was broken. Keanu now knew exactly where he stood with the people signing the checks. He knew that they didn't believe in him. They weren't rooting for him to succeed. They were just waiting to see if he would fail so they could say, "I told you so." This was the turning point for Keanu. He realized that he could never rely on the approval of the suits. He realized that in this industry, you are only as good as your last hit, and sometimes not even then. The rejection he faced in these months could have destroyed his confidence. Many young actors had been crushed by less, but instead of breaking him, it toughened him up. It gave him a thick skin that he would need for the rest of his career. He learned that the only opinion that mattered was his own, and the opinion of the audience watching the screen. The studio didn't suddenly become his best friend. They remained nervous up until the release date. They were still hesitant about the marketing, still unsure if people would accept a kid as an action hero. They kept their distance, treating the movie like a risky gamble, even after seeing how good it was. They lacked the vision to see what was coming. They were still living in the past, stuck in the era of muscles and explosions. While the future was standing right in front of them, covered in dust and sweat, proving them wrong with every single take. So, as the filming wrapped up and the post-production began, the mood was complicated. The crew celebrated because they knew they had made something special. The director was proud because he had defended his vision. The studio was cautiously optimistic, but still skeptical. And Keanu? Keanu was just getting started. He had endured the whispers, the threats of replacement, and the lack of respect. He had taken every hit and kept moving forward. The plan to kick him out had failed, but the real test was still to come. The movie was done, and now it was time to see if the audience would agree with the executives, or if they would side with the underdog who fought for his place in the sun. This was the calm before the storm, and nobody, not even Keanu, knew just how big that storm was going to be. The rumors of his impending firing didn't stay hidden in the boardrooms for long. In Hollywood, secrets are like currency, and this particular piece of gossip was too valuable to keep. It eventually trickled down to the people who mattered the most, the crew on the set. These were the cameramen, the lighting technicians, the makeup artists, and the stunt drivers. They were the ones building the world of the movie, day in and day out. When they heard that the studio executives wanted to replace their leading man, the mood on the set shifted. It wasn't just gossip anymore. It was a betrayal waiting to happen. For Keanu, hearing these whispers was a crushing blow, but it wasn't a surprise. He had always felt the skepticism radiating from the studio offices. He knew they looked at him and saw a lightweight actor, a kid from the comedies who was playing dress-up in an action movie. But knowing that they were actively plotting to remove him, to erase his hard work and hand his role to someone else, triggered something deep inside him. It lit a fire that no studio executive could put out. He realized that pleading his case in meetings wouldn't work. Trying to charm them with a smile wouldn't work. The only way to fight back was to outwork everyone else. He had to be so good, so dedicated, and so undeniable that firing him would be impossible. Keanu decided that he would become the action hero they thought he couldn't be. Not by acting like one, but by living like one. This transformation didn't happen in front of the cameras. It happened in the lonely hours before dawn and the exhausted hours after sunset. While the studio executives slept comfortably in their beds, Keanu was in a gym or a makeshift dojo, pushing his body past its limits. He wasn't just learning lines. He was training as if his life depended on it. He hired the best martial arts instructors and weapons trainers. He learned how to hold a gun with the confidence of a SWAT officer. He learned how to move his body in a fight, how to take a punch, and how to roll with the impact. The physical toll was immense. His body was constantly bruised. His knees ached from the constant running and jumping. He lost weight because he was burning more energy than he could eat. But every bruise and every ache was a badge of honor to him. It was proof that he was taking this seriously, even if the suits weren't. He stopped socializing. He stopped going to parties. His entire world shrank down to the movie set and the training mat. He became obsessed with proving them wrong, turning his anger and his fear into pure physical focus. The real test of this new mentality came during the filming of the bus sequences. For those who don't know, the movie's speed revolved around a bus that could not slow down. Filming these scenes wasn't done on a green screen with computers. It was done for real, on real highways, with real stunts. The danger was palpable. There is one specific moment that defines Keanu's commitment: the jump in the script. The character had to jump from a speeding car onto the moving bus. It sounds simple on paper, but in reality, it was terrifying. The stunt coordinator looked at the speeds and the gap between the vehicles and said, "We use a dummy for this, or we use a stunt double. We saw risky for the star. If he slipped, if he missed the mark by an inch, he could have been seriously hurt or worse." The studio executives, when they heard about the stunt, absolutely forbade it. They sent urgent messages to the set saying that under no circumstances was the star to attempt the jump. They were terrified of the liability and the bad press if their liability got injured. But when the day came to film, Keanu walked onto the highway with a different plan. He stood by the side of the road, watching the cars speed by, feeling the wind rush against his face. He looked at the stunt coordinator, a man who had risked his life many times, and told him he was going to do it. The stunt coordinator tried to talk him out of it, reminding him of the studio's orders. Keanu just shook his head. He explained that if he didn't do it, the audience would know. They would feel it. They would see a cut, a double, and the illusion would break. He said he had to do it to earn the audience's trust, so the cameras rolled. The car sped up. The bus sped up. The gap between them was a blur of asphalt. When the director yelled "action," Keanu didn't hesitate. He didn't think about the studio executives or the insurance policies. He ran. He pushed off from the car with everything he had and flew through the air. For a split second, he was suspended between safety and danger. He slammed onto the side of the bus, his hands grabbing the rail, his feet scrambling for a foothold. It was violent and ungraceful, but it was real. He hauled himself up, adrenaline pumping through his veins, and delivered his line. When the director called cut, there was a moment of silence on the set. Then, the entire crew erupted into applause. It wasn't just polite clapping. It was genuine respect. The stunt coordinator looked at him with new eyes. He wasn't just the actor anymore. He was one of them. He was a risk taker. He was a professional. The word of this stunt spread quickly, but the studio executives didn't see it as bravery. They saw it as recklessness. They were furious that he had disobeyed them. They didn't understand that he was saving their movie by making it real. This pattern continued throughout the production. Every time there was a difficult scene, a dangerous stunt, or a physically exhausting moment, Keanu was the first one to volunteer. He worked harder than the stunt doubles. He stayed later than the director. There were days when he was so tired he could barely stand, but he would never show it in front of the camera. The moment the director said action, his eyes would sharpen, his posture would change, and he would become the hero Jack Traven. He knew the crew was watching him. He knew that if he complained, they would complain. If he quit, they would quit. So, he set the standard. This created a powerful bond between the actor and the crew. In Hollywood, crews are used to actors who are distant, difficult, or diva-like. They are used to actors who sit in their trailers playing video games while the crew sets up the scene in the hot sun. Keanu was the opposite. He was on the set helping to move lights, offering water to the grips, and joking with the production assistants. He treated everyone with the same level of respect, whether they were the director or the person sweeping the floor. The crew saw how hard he was working and how poorly the studio was treating him. They didn't just like him. They loved him. They became his army. They decided right then and there that they would not let the studio destroy this movie, or this man. There is a human element to this story that goes beyond just the movie business. It is about the dignity of work. Keanu felt that he had been given a huge opportunity, and he respected the craft of filmmaking too much to treat it lightly. He respected the money the studio was spending, ironically, more than the studio did by giving them his absolute best effort. The executives looked at spreadsheets and risks. Keanu looked at the work and the people doing it. He connected with the human beings around him. This bond became crucial as the filming moved toward the climax, the subway scenes. These were the most complex and dangerous parts of the entire shoot. It involved filming on actual subway tracks, with real trains moving at high speeds. The studio anxiety reached a fever pitch. They were constantly threatening to shut down production or move the production to a safer, more controllable studio lot. But the director and the crew, fueled by Keanu's energy, pushed back. They had captured lightning in a bottle on the streets and highways. They knew they couldn't fake it in a studio. Keanu's response to the mounting pressure from the studio was not to fight them with lawyers or publicists. He fought them with excellence. Every time they tried to undermine him, he responded by doing his job better than anyone else could. He learned the subway routes. He memorized the timing of the trains. He worked with the stunt team to choreograph a fight that looked brutal but was safe. He was in the zone, a state of mind where nothing matters except the task at hand. The studio executives continued to look for reasons to fire him. Right up until the final days of shooting, they would send representatives to the set to watch him work, hoping to catch him making a mistake or acting unprofessionally. But what they saw was a man who was completely dedicated. They saw an actor who was bleeding for his art. They saw a leader who had earned the fierce loyalty of everyone on the set. They didn't know what to do with that. Their playbooks didn't have a chapter on how to deal with someone who refuses to give up. By the time the final scenes were being shot, the dynamic on the set had completely flipped. The studio was no longer in control of the movie. The movie was being controlled by the sheer force of will of the people making it. The director refused to cut scenes. The crew worked overtime without complaint. And Keanu Reeves stood at the center of it all, battered, bruised, and more focused than ever before. He had taken their doubt and used it to build a fortress of hard work. They thought they could kick him out, but he had made himself so essential to the process that removing him would have destroyed the entire film. He hadn't just won the role. He had earned it, drop of sweat by drop of sweat. As the production of Speed moved into its final and most dangerous phase, the atmosphere on the set thickened like the air before a thunderstorm. The crew was filming the climax of the movie, the grand finale inside a subway train. This wasn't a controlled environment inside a quiet studio. They were filming in the actual subway tunnels of Los Angeles, amidst the dust, the heat, and the deafening roar of real trains. The stakes were higher than ever. If the ending didn't work, the entire movie would collapse. It was during this critical time that the studio executives decided to make their move. They weren't just watching from afar anymore. They were coming to the set to see if their plan to replace Keanu Reeves should finally be executed. The executives arrived in a convoy of expensive black cars, looking completely out of place amidst the grease and grime of the subway terminal. They stepped out wearing tailored suits and polished shoes, squinting in the harsh industrial lighting. They didn't look like filmmakers. They looked like accountants inspecting a failing factory. Their faces were grim. They had seen the budget reports, and they had seen the risks. They were convinced that this chaotic, dangerous production was being led by an actor who was in over his head. They came with a specific mission: to assess the footage, confirm their doubts, and likely pull the plug on Keanu's involvement to salvage what they could. The tension between the studio visitors and the film crew was palpable. The crew, who had been working side by side with Keanu for months, viewed these executives with hostility. They knew that the people in the suits were the ones who wanted to fire their friend. There was a standoffish feeling in the air. The director, Jan de Bont, was a ball of nervous energy. He knew this was his chance to prove the studio wrong. But he also knew that one wrong move could give the executives the excuse they needed to shut him down. He ushered the executives into the video village, a small area filled with monitors where they could watch the filming live without getting in the way. The scene they were about to film was incredibly complex. It involved a brutal hand-to-hand fight on top of a moving subway car, followed by a derailment sequence. It required absolute precision and physical courage. The executives sat in their canvas chairs, arms crossed, holding their notepads like weapons. They were ready to take notes on every mistake. They expected to see hesitation. They expected to see fear. They were looking for proof that Keanu wasn't tough enough. Keanu, meanwhile, was preparing himself physically and mentally. He was covered in dust and sweat. His knuckles were wrapped in tape. He had been training for this specific moment for months, pushing his body through pain and exhaustion. He didn't look at the executives. He didn't care that they were there. In his mind, he wasn't on a movie set anymore. He was in a fight for his life and his career. He stood near the subway car, visualizing every move, every punch, every fall. The stunt coordinator gave him a final pat on the back, a silent gesture of solidarity. The bond between the actor and the stunt team was unbreakable now. They were a family, and the executives were the intruders. "Action!" the director shouted. The subway car began to move, and the wind in the tunnel whipped through the set. Keanu launched himself into the scene. What the executives saw on the monitors shocked them into silence. They didn't see the goofy actor from the comedies. They saw a man fighting for survival. Keanu's movements were sharp and aggressive. He threw punches with real force. When he was hit, he sold it with a guttural grunt that sounded painfully real. He was sprinting across the top of a moving train, dodging obstacles with a fluidity that was breathtaking. There was a moment during the take where Keanu had to slide under a low-hanging beam while the train rushed through the dark tunnel. It was a life-or-death maneuver. If he mistimed it by a fraction of a second, he could have been seriously injured. The executives in the video village stopped breathing. They leaned forward in their seats, their eyes glued to the screens. They forgot about their notes. They forgot about their power. They were just human beings watching another human being do something extraordinary. Keanu didn't just clear the beam, he did it with style, popping back up instantly to continue the fight. The climax of the scene involved the subway car crashing and derailing. This was done with pyrotechnics and massive mechanical rigs. The noise was ear-splitting. The chaos was total. But amidst the flying sparks and twisting metal, the cameras captured Keanu's face. It was a look of pure intensity and determination. In that moment, the character of Jack Traven came alive. He wasn't acting cool. He looked battered, desperate, and utterly heroic. It was the kind of image that movie posters are made of. When the director finally called cut, the set erupted. The crew cheered, not just because the shot was done, but because they had witnessed greatness. The adrenaline was high. Stunt team members rushed to make sure everyone was okay. Keanu was gasping for air, his chest heaving, covered in dirt, but he was smiling. That smile wasn't the goofy grin of Bill and Ted. It was the smile of a warrior who had just won a battle. The executives, however, sat in stunned silence. They looked at each other, their faces pale. The man they had wanted to kick off the movie had just delivered a performance better than anything they could have imagined. They realized that their plans to fire him were not just foolish. They were dangerous to the success of the film. They had completely misjudged him. They thought he was soft, but he was made of steel. They thought he was a liability, but he was the movie's greatest asset. One of the senior executives stood up and walked over to the director. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. He started to say something about the schedule, about the safety protocols, about the notes he had prepared. But the director, Jan de Bont, cut him off. Jan didn't shout. He didn't get angry. He just pointed at the monitor, replaying the footage. He told the executive, "That is your movie. That is your star. He just saved your film." The power dynamic shifted in that instant. The executives realized they had no leverage. They couldn't fire Keanu now. He had become the heart and soul of the production. The crew loved him. The director trusted him. And the footage was undeniably brilliant. If they fired him now, they would look like villains, and they would risk a revolt from the entire team. They had no choice but to back down. They quietly put away their notepads. They stopped whispering about replacements. They accepted the reality that was staring them in the face. This was a major victory for Keanu, but it was a quiet one. He didn't gloat. He didn't march over to the executives and demand an apology. He just went back to work. He helped clean up the set after the crash scene. He shook hands with the grips and lighting technicians. He treated the victory with humility. This humility only made the executives respect him more, though it likely confused them. They were used to ego and arrogance. They didn't know how to handle someone who just wanted to do the work and do it well. The remainder of the filming went smoothly. The dark cloud of doubt had lifted. The studio stopped interfering as much, finally trusting the director and the actor they had hired. The relationship didn't become warm and fuzzy. The executives were too proud for that, but the war was over. They realized that Keanu's dedication wasn't just for show. It was his way of life. He had earned his place on that movie set through blood, sweat, and tears. Looking back, this moment on the subway set was the turning point not just for Speed, but for Keanu's entire career. It was the moment he stopped being a teen actor and became a leading man. He had faced the ultimate test. The people holding the purse strings wanted him gone. And he fought his way back with nothing but his own two hands and his refusal to quit. It is a powerful reminder that sometimes when people doubt you, the best revenge is simply to prove them wrong by being undeniably excellent. The executives learned a lesson that day, one that Hollywood often forgets. You can measure a budget on a spreadsheet, but you cannot measure a human heart on a piece of paper. Keanu passed the test, and the movie was saved. When the filming finally wrapped and the cameras stopped rolling, the battle wasn't actually over. The movie was in the can, as they say in the industry. But now came the part that terrified the studio executives even more: releasing it to the public. The post-production period was filled with anxiety. The editors worked long hours to piece the movie together, trying to make sense of the chaos they had captured. The studio heads were still nervous. They had seen the footage, yes, and they knew Keanu had pulled off the stunts. But in their minds, the risk remained. They were still unconvinced that the public would buy this surfer dude as a serious action hero. The marketing team had a difficult job. They didn't know how to sell Keanu Reeves. In the early posters and trailers, they focused heavily on the bus. They showed the concept of a bomb on a bus more than the actor driving it. They were hedging their bets, still afraid that Keanu's face on the poster might drive people away. As the summer of 1994 approached, the buzz around Hollywood was mixed. Some people who had seen early test screenings were whispering that the movie was incredible, a non-stop thrill ride. Others were skeptical, predicting a flop. The release date was set, and the studio executives braced themselves for the worst. They prepared excuses. They planned their exit strategies. They told themselves that if the movie failed, it wasn't their fault, it was the casting. They had done their due diligence by trying to fire him after all. In their minds, their hands were clean. Then, the movie opened. The reaction was immediate and explosive. From the very first Friday, audiences packed theaters across the country. The energy inside the cinemas was electric. People weren't just watching the movie. They were experiencing it. They screamed during the jumps. They gasped during the crashes. And most importantly, they fell in love with the hero. They saw a character who wasn't a Superman, but a regular guy who was scared but kept going anyway. They connected with Keanu's vulnerability. They saw themselves in him. The critics, who had been ready to tear the movie apart, were surprisingly kind. Reviews poured in, praising the film's speed and tension, but they specifically singled out Keanu. They called him likable, genuine, and surprisingly tough. The box office numbers were the final judge, jury, and executioner of the studio's doubts. The movie didn't just do well. It dominated. It stayed at the #1 spot for weeks. It made hundreds of millions of dollars, turning into a massive global blockbuster. It was the definition of a summer hit. The phone lines at the studio office were ringing off the hook. It's not with complaints, but with distributors begging for more screens. The little movie they had wanted to shut down was now printing money for them, for the executives. This was a moment of total embarrassment. They had to sit in their high-rise offices and watch the receipts pile up, knowing that the actor they had tried to fire was the reason for their success. They had to eat a massive slice of humble pie. The irony was lost on no one. The plan to kick Keanu out now looked like the single stupidest decision they had almost made. If they had succeeded in firing him, they would have destroyed a franchise before it even began. They would have lost millions. They had dodged a bullet, not because of their cleverness, but because they had failed to act on their bad instincts in time. But the true victory belonged to Keanu. He didn't gloat. He didn't give interviews saying, "I told you so." Simply accepted the success with the same grace he had accepted the doubt. When asked about the rumors that he was almost replaced, he just brushed them off. He focused on the work. He thanked the crew, the stuntmen, and the director. He knew that he hadn't done it alone. He shared the victory with the people who had stood by him when the studio was against him. This class act only made the public love him more. He wasn't just a star. He was a decent guy in an industry of sharks. This success changed everything for Keanu Reeves. It broke the Ted curse. He was no longer typecast as the goofy slacker. He had proven he could carry a massive action movie. Hollywood power players finally saw his value. Offers for other big-budget action movies started flooding in. He could pick and choose his projects. He had leverage. He had respect. But more importantly, he had the confidence that comes from surviving a fire. He knew he could take on a challenge even when everyone said it was impossible, and come out on top. A few years later, when the studio came back to him begging for a sequel, Speed 2: Cruise Control, Keanu did something that showed just how much control he had gained over his own career. He read the script. He didn't like it. He didn't feel it was right for the character, so he turned it down. This was a power move that few actors in Hollywood could make. He walked away from a huge paycheck and a guaranteed blockbuster because he wanted to respect the art and the audience. The studio was shocked. They offered him more money. He still said no. He stood his ground. This was the man they almost fired. Now dictating terms to the most powerful studio in town, the vindication continued throughout his career. Because of the foundation laid by Speed, he was able to take risks. He made The Matrix, a movie that studios were also unsure about because it was too weird and too philosophical. But Keanu fought for that role too, and it became one of the greatest sci-fi franchises in history. Later in life, he reinvented himself again with John Wick, proving that an older actor could still outperform everyone else in the business. Every time he succeeded, he was silently proving the doubters from the Speed era wrong again and again. Looking back at the story, it's a powerful lesson about human potential and the danger of underestimating others. The executives in this story aren't evil people. They're just examples of how fear and groupthink can make people blind. They were afraid of risk, so they tried to eliminate the thing that made the movie unique: Keanu's humanity. They wanted a safe, generic action star. Instead, they've got a dedicated artist who bled for his work. The studio's plan to kick him out was a classic mistake of valuing image over substance. The story of Speed isn't just about a bus. It's about a man who refused to let other people define his limits. It's about the courage to keep going when the people in charge are betting against you. Keanu Reeves showed that you don't need to be loud, arrogant, or politically savvy to win. You just need to work harder than everyone else. You need to care more. When they thought kicking him out was a good idea, he didn't fight them with lawyers or press releases. He fought them with excellence. He fought them by becoming indispensable. In the end, the executives were wrong, but in a way, they were the biggest losers. They missed out on the joy of believing in someone. They missed out on the satisfaction of nurturing a star. They played it safe and almost lost big, while Keanu risked it all and won everything. The movie is remembered for the explosions and the stunts. But the real legacy of that summer is the triumph of determination over doubt. Every time someone watches Speed today, they are watching a victory lap for a guy who refused to be told he wasn't good enough. And that is a story that never gets old.